Hey everybody, hope you're doing well today. This is Regan Edens here, and we are getting ready to kick off CMC War Room. I appreciate your time and attention, and also all of us have been very busy with the issuance of the CMC 2.0 rule for review and public comment, and I genuinely appreciate the opportunity to spend time with you and to talk about these requirements. We are grateful to our sponsors. Our sponsors are outstanding influencers in technology and people who genuinely have a vested interest in meeting these requirements and in their efforts within the Coalition of the Willing to be able to help you, guide you, and help you understand these requirements and connect you with the resources that you need in order to navigate your way. Now, CMC War Room is different from Mythbusters. We do Mythbusters, and we have done Mythbusters for the past 4 years. But the reality is that CMC War Room is really hitting on the specific strategic and operational and technical issues which are important to the CMC ecosystem. And we kicked off last year and had an excellent year. And this year, we are starting this out with the CMC 2.0 rule. Now, I have executed this analysis in support of the CMC Industry Standards Council, and in part, it's a part of the analysis that I presented to them several weeks ago, and I hope that it's valuable to you. Now, my name is Regan Edens, and I am very fortunate enough and honored and privileged, really, to have served within this ecosystem as a plank holding member within the Cyber AB, and as a volunteer underneath those very, very difficult first 18 months within the pandemic, along with my other colleagues, to be able to help establish the foundation for this ecosystem and these requirements. And I have spent literally my entire adult life in service to my country, and I can tell you that, and I have spent as a former Army Ranger, I spent my entire career picking and having been chosen for the most difficult missions. And I can promise you that there has been nothing harder than that work in the beginning and continuing forward in support of the CMC ecosystem. Out of those responsibilities, we established the CMC Industry Standards Council, which are plank holding members, most of them, with the CMC Industry Standards Group, which literally dedicated thousands of hours, not kidding, about 19,000 volunteer hours to understanding these requirements, developing the second version of the CMC assessment guide, and in trying to get our arms around the challenges that we face within understanding these requirements and meeting these requirements. And so, as a part of that CMC Industry Standards Council, I'm very humble and privileged to be standing shoulder to shoulder with members of the Coalition of Willing, some of the most outstanding people within this ecosystem. Now, DTC Global, this is the only time I will mention this, does this for a living. This is what we do. We are not a sledge-o-matic. We do not slice. We do not dice. Well, the only thing we do is understand these requirements and help our clients meet these requirements. So it's very important that you realize that this has been my sole focus and passion and mission literally for the last 5 dog years of my life, for probably 6 dog years, and 4 of those being calendar years since 2019. Okay, so we take this very seriously, and we appreciate your time and attention in walking through these requirements. Now, as I mentioned, the CMC Industry Standards Council, we finally got up the organizational page. And because we are everyone is very busy. And I encourage you to go to CMMC industrystandardscouncil.org and look at that page. And that will give you some insight to the fundamentals about the CMC Industry Standards Council, and also to get a sense for who are participating. Now, that's a brand new web page, and we don't have everyone's logos up, so my apologies for that. But we will continue to get everyone's information in and get them represented as they should be within the Industry Standards Council. They are people who literally dedicate hours of their lives every single week to discuss these issues in detail, to, again, further to the depth and breadth of understanding these requirements for clarity. And they consist of practitioners, vendors, technology providers, C3POs, practitioners across this ecosystem. One of the things that's important to me, and that's important to the CMC Industry Standards Council, is the fact that one of our members, Michael Redmond, had a devastating set of consequences result with him just prior to the holidays, and he is in a vegetative state, and he needs your help. We did an initial fundraiser for him and his family, and I encourage you to go to the No Man Left Behind page on the CMC Industry Standards Council website, and at the bottom of that, please donate to his GoFundMe page. It doesn't have to be a large amount. And people have already given, and I ask and encourage you to give again. There could be no more severe consequence to him, and it really does make me upset, and to his family, than the situation that he's found himself in with severe brain damage, and it is really, really heartbreaking, to be honest with you. So he is a great friend, veteran. And it is a terrible set of consequences that have resulted. So, with that, I ask you to step forward and please donate and help his family. Okay, and they would greatly appreciate that, and so would I. All right. With that, the use of the content of this broadcast is copyrighted. It is not for public use, and the rights are reserved. And the reason for that is because I have literally dedicated hundreds of hours to understanding these requirements and giving you the analysis. I ask you to be respectful in the use or reuse of this information for your own personal use. And if you'd like to reuse it, I would reach out to us. You can reach out to me through LinkedIn if you have my email address already, and gladly provide you permission to use. I only ask that you a reference and cite the CMC Industry Standards Council, and I get no personal recognition for it at all. All right. With that, let's get to it. CMC 2.0. The devil's in the details, folks. And we only have a short period of time together. An hour and a half isn't really that long. And what I'm trying to do is reserve a time period to really go through any questions that you might have. We're going to rip off the Band-Aid here, and we are going to look at these requirements from a new perspective, because it's very unlikely, unfortunately, that you're aware of the existing requirements in their DFARS and how they fit together underneath CMMC 2.0. So there are lots of things to say, and what I'm telling you is no substitution whatsoever for you doing your own due diligence and your own work. This is a lot to digest, folks. And so there are a lot of people who want to be first, right, and tell you about these, and have their first hands up and fill the air with really empty platitudes about these requirements. It's 250 plus pages. It takes time to digest this, and it is pretty remarkable what they've done here. And the more you understand these requirements, the more you can really be in awe of how difficult it is to do this, and how difficult it is to really bring these together. And I have great admiration for the level of detail and for the work that the DoD has produced here. It is truly remarkable. Okay, with that, let's talk about how we got here, because how we got here is very important. Since December 31st of 2017, you have been under these requirements or aware of these requirements. And now, if you have a current contract, and that current contract was started after December 31st of 2017, you're underneath the requirements for the beginning of beginning of that contract with the DFAR 7012 contract clause. All right. Now, when I say DFAR 7012 contract clause, it's a Defense Acquisition Regulation supplement, contract clause 252, 204, 7012. All right. And we're going to talk about these things. And if you don't know a particular acronym, please write it down and ask during the Q&A. I'm happy to explain this. This a broadcast is for those who are aware of these requirements, because you're going to understand with the speed for which I go through these. And one of the things that I didn't mention is that if you are welcome to take a screenshot of any of the slides that I present, and there's a lot of data on those slides. It's intended to do so. And the reason for that is because I want you to have a reference for what I tell you, and a citation, and a place to go to understand the requirements and learn more, so that you can use the actual slide itself as a reference, right? So you can learn more for it. So you're not going to see 3 bullet points from me. That's not what I do. I'm providing you the totality of the detail as much as possible, and I'll highlight what's important from the slide that I present. So feel free again to please screenshot as you need. All right. So with that, the reality is that the DoD has been building a very capable set of organizations and assets and policies in place to enforce these requirements, folks. And I have it through a trusted source that there are literally thousands of back order cases with the Department of Justice for the False Claims Act right now. So I can tell you it has been all quiet, but the Western Front is busy. So please be very careful with I convey the understanding of the current requirements that you have to meet right now, and the interdependence of those current requirements to the CMC 2.0 rule. Okay. So the proposed rule was released on December 23rd, and it will go live, historically speaking, 12 months from the time it was released. Could be before or after the comment period. I don't think that really matters, but roughly March of 2024, or could be January or February. Okay. You should fully expect, historically speaking, that the rule will go into effect. Okay. That means that 6 short months from then, phase 2 begins, folks. So phase 1 starts ostensibly 12 months from the release of the rule. And then 6 months would be phase 2. And we'll go over that in detail at the end. Now, my thoughts on the overall rule. All right. It is a very, very well done rule. Now, there have been people that, it's not your typical rule, to say the least. And the reason for that is that many people may not understand that the rule encompasses what would normally be a level of detail within a DoD memorandum, and then DoD instruction, and DoD directives, right? And additional DoD policies. And then the issuance of a standard, right? And then the issuance of a contract clause related to those requirements. So the reality is that the CMT 2.0 integrates these things all into one. And if you are a student of these requirements, which I am, you will truly appreciate the complexity of the requirements as they are, and the ability to capture with sufficient detail the amount of information, and to convey that detail with the appropriate level of information to you to understand these requirements is an enormous challenge. And I cannot tell you how much praise that I have for the DoD with regard to this. Now, people who know me well will realize that I've not always been, I've always been supportive of the DoD mission, of course, but there have been challenges in going through and how to convey this information, right? And what level of detail. And that has always been a challenge to the DoD and a challenge to ecosystem participants. But the rule itself is a remarkable work. And my hat is off to the rule team. And I am grateful that they have done such an exquisite job in the level of detail, the level of citation and reference within that detail. And yes, can it be improved? Of course it can. And we're going to touch on a couple of those things now. The most important thing is this: does the rule provide you with much and the appropriate information to make good decisions and to execute? Yes, it does. Will it withstand a challenge? Absolutely, it will withstand a challenge. And you had better believe that the enforcement is coming down like a freight train. Okay. So it's very important that you realize that the hand-wringing and empty platitudes that people are providing you is not sufficient, a sufficient substitute for you to understand these requirements, folks. okay, and to take action. And so I hope to provide the appropriate level of detail and explanation so that you understand these requirements with as much clarity as I can convey within the limited time period. Okay. So with that, there are a couple important takeaways from the get-go. One is that the NIST 80171 Rev 2 is the law of the land. It always has been, quite frankly, as the federal standard. The additional guidance required by the scoping guide is absolutely required and necessary to meet these requirements. NIST 80171 Alpha is the law of the land with regard to the standard for assessing these requirements. It always has been underneath CY notices. The use of the assessment guides is an option, and it is not one that I recommend. Okay, and there are reasons for that I've covered in other broadcasts. Sufficient to say is they'll probably end up going away, and that's probably actually appropriate because it creates confusion about these requirements. Remember that it's the 2.11 version of these guides if you choose to use them as a reference. Do not use the 2.0 version of that. The 2.11 version is not available on the DoD website. It's only available through the rulemaking process. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is I would not use them. Simply stick with the NIST 80171 Rev 2 and the appropriate reference cited within the rule and the scoping guide, and you will be golden. All right. Now, this requires a level of expertise and detail, which you may not have, but I encourage you that you need to seek that out with urgency and priority. So it's also important that you realize that in order to be eligible in phase one, you must meet the eligibility requirements for phase one. Okay, in phase one. So phase one is not the preparation to meet requirements. When phase one begins, and I'll talk about this more in detail, when phase one begins in the issuance of the contracts related to the requirements as they're stated in phase one, you must be eligible, unless there is an exception, you must be eligible in phase one. Okay. And we'll talk about that more later in the broadcast. What's most importantly is that the rule explicitly encompasses the D.FAR 7012 requirements. It explicitly encompasses the requirements which are currently underneath DoD policy for your supply chain. In order to be eligible to certify, you must have done the things that the D.FAR 7012 asks of you, and in addition to having your supply chain meet requirements as well. Okay, that's explicitly stated within the rule. So it's very important that you realize that, and we'll highlight those in additional details. So those of you who are not familiar or breaking off the dust, so to speak, off of the compartmentalized portion of your mind, right? The CMC model is now being established underneath the 32 CFR Part 170. The purpose of that model is very important, and it is one of the most essential cornerstones of information that you must understand to meet these requirements. The purpose of the 2.0 program is one purpose only. That is to protect the sensitive data that's compartmentalized into two different categories: federal contract information and controlled and classified information, which consists of 24 different categories of information relative to your contract performance. And the assessment of the systems that process, store, or transmit the federal contract information or controlled and classified information relative to the performance of the contract. Okay, so that is fundamental. It's not compliance for compliance sake, folks. It's not cybersecurity for cybersecurity's sake. The purpose of the rule is to protect the data wherever the data is, in whatever form that the data is, according to DoD policy. So anything is in scope and everything is in scope unless it's logically or physically separated from the CUI. That's important for you to know. Okay, there are no magical outs, even within the scoping guide. Everything is in scope if it is not that for which CUI flows, process, stores, or transmits, or has access to, that is not logically or physically separated. That is vital and critical, because those things that are not logically and physically separated must meet the applicable prescribed security requirements and security standard according to the CMMC 2.0 rule. Now, Reagan, you said security requirements several times. Yes, I have. And underneath the rule, the purpose of the CMC Level 2 assessment or self-assessment for the purposes, one is for the purposes of assessing for the purposes of affirmation, and the other one is for the purposes of certification. You must implement the security requirements relative to the controlled and classified information that you receive or that you develop in performance of the contract. Okay, that includes and the NIST 800-171 requirements. That includes the all the requirements that are encompassed within the DFARS 252, 204, 7012 contract clause. And we're going to spend some time because it's absolutely vital and important that you understand what that really means, folks. So the security requirements are defined as those requirements derived from the applicable laws, regulations, and government-wide policies, standards, and instructions, and regulations and procedures that are required of you when by agreement through the contract clause when you process, store, transmit CUI. So within the definition underneath FIPS, which is directly applicable to the requirements definition that that's used within the 2.0 rule, the purpose of those requirements is to ensure the confidentiality and to ensure that the integrity and availability of the system is there. But specifically, we focus on underneath CMC 2.0 and NIST 171 requirements, confidentiality. So the key features of the program are also vital and important for you to know. It is a tiered model. Levels 1, 2, and 3. Only 10% of you or less will be tier 3. Tier 2 is the focus of today's discussion. Okay. That tiered model requires an assessment of you. It requires an assessment of you by yourself with the purposes of affirmation on a Sarbanes-Oxley style affirmation, or for you to be assessed by a third-party organization, okay, to verify the implementation of those requirements. Okay. The devil's in the details, folks, and we're going to dive into what that really means when we implement the requirements relative to the performance of the contract. That's the key to the entire thing, that the requirements are focused on what essential capabilities are necessary to perform the contract. So let's dive into what it means when it means assessment criteria. The definition of assessment criteria is provided by the CMC 2.0 rule, okay? Underneath 32 CFR Part 170B, underneath the definition of assessment. And that means the testing and evaluation of security controls to determine the extent for which the controls are implemented correctly, operating as intended, and producing the desired outcome with respect to meeting the security requirements, okay? Notice that that it is the controls that you implement to address the security requirements. So the security requirements meaning that definition right there. And so we'll tear that apart because that's absolutely essential for you to understand that when we implement the NIST 800-171 security controls, those are the technical controls, and we add the additional layers on top of them, okay? So what does that mean by controls, and what does that mean in the relationship to the security requirements? Security requirements, as it's mentioned in the definition of assessment, are those laws, regulations, and government-wide policies which are required and prescribed to safeguard the data. Security controls are also prescribed, and they consist of the management and the operational and the technical controls for the information system relative to the performance of the contract in order to protect the confidentiality of the data. All right. The standard for that, when we come together, is the CMMC 2.0 assessment definition of assessment, which means that those controls, the management and the operation and the technical controls, must be implemented correctly, operating as intended, and producing the desired outcome. That is the standard for performance and for evaluation underneath the CMC 2.0. Okay. Many of you may not have realized that. You may have thought met, not met, and we'll explain how this comes together. So when we have the current standard for the DFARS 7012 clause, we have security requirements. We have to implement security controls, and we do that. What's already given to us in the example of that is the current control underneath 3.12.1. That's the security control assessment. And the definition of that, you'll notice, is very, very suspiciously just like the definition for assessment underneath the CMC 2.0 rule. The standard for that is the NIST 800-171. And the DoD assessment methodology is required underneath the DFAR 7019 and 7020 contract clauses. That document is the DoD assessment methodology version 1.2.1. All of these things are required underneath the current DFAR 7012 requirements. Okay. And we will again explain how this integrates underneath the 2.0 rule. So underneath these requirements, just so that you understand why the rule of what has changed in the rule is that the certification, the standard for certification is defined underneath FIPS 200. CMC 2.0 did not make that up. And so that existing standard for certification requires a security control assessment of the security controls as we defined it on the left-hand side of the screen, meaning the management and the operational and the technical controls. We use those to address the security requirements as they're required for CUI and federal contract information underneath the 32 CFR 2002 U.S. Code of Federal Regulation. Okay. DoD instruction also provides a level of detail which we must apply to the implementation of these management, operational, and technical controls to safeguard the CUI. These are 100% required underneath the current DFARS 252, 204, 7012 clause. Okay, and I will show you why. When we have security controls underneath the NIST 800-171, they match the definition of what security controls are underneath both the CMC 2.0 definition of assessment, and they certainly, of course, match the definition for security controls underneath the FIPS 200 and the current requirements as they are right now. CMC practices is a new term that's introduced in the CMC 2.0, but those are security controls. Okay, they are prescribed requirements as well, just like the NIST 800-171 function as requirements and controls, because they are both prescribed as law in underneath the 32 CFR 2002 requirements, and they are implemented. And when they are implemented, they're implemented as security controls. We are required underneath the DFAR 7012 to have evidence for the implementation of these requirements, adequate and sufficient evidence. And the DIPCAC describes that evidence very succinctly on its webpage on the in the latter half of that webpage underneath the pre-assessment criteria. You need to look at that if you want to understand the level of detail and sufficiency that's required to meet the current requirements. There is no difference. There is no difference. Both the DIPCAC right now and underneath the Joint Surveillance, Volunteer Surveillance Assessment Program will conduct the examination, the interview, and the testing of that evidence. And there will be 100% evidence examination of all of your documentation. Your documentation is absolutely critical to be sufficient and adequate, must include the level of detail sufficient to demonstrate that you are actually doing this and that you understand the requirements and you have the sufficient level of detail for your organization to execute the requirements. That is substantiated during the interview portion, and that's substantiated during the testing portion. Ultimately, the current standard, which is identical to the CMC 2.0 standard for the assessment, has it been implemented correctly? Is it operating intended? And is it producing the desired outcome? That is the current standard, folks, underneath these requirements. And there's no change whatsoever. When in fact, I wrote this slide in 2021 and 2022. Okay. There is no difference whatsoever. And I will show you how it migrates over specifically in the 2.0 rule. Underneath that standard, there's a difference in terminology. Underneath the 171, it says satisfied or not satisfied the requirements. Underneath the CMC 2.0 guide, it says met and not met. But the criteria for what deems has been satisfied or what has been deemed as met or not met is only one standard. And that's defined both in the FIPS 200 and the NIST 800-171 and in the CMC 2.0 rule underneath the implemented correctly, operating as intended, and producing the desired outcome. When we have done these things, we will have met the requirements underneath the CMC 2.0. We will have satisfied the requirements according to the federal standard underneath NIST 800-171 and 171 alpha. There's no ambiguity. There's no uncertainty about that relationship. Now, An additional requirement underneath the 7019, it currently is the DoD self-assessment methodology, which uses this exact same criteria, folks, to determine, which you should, with adequate and sufficient evidence, what your SPRS score is. It is not a gimme. It's not a mulligan. It is not a, well, I think this fits. Okay. It is have the controls, management, operational, technical controls, been implemented correctly, operating as intended, and producing the desired outcome in order to satisfy each of the assessment objectives within the NIST 800-171, in order to satisfy the prescribed security requirements for the controlled and classified information that you have in relationship to the performance of the contract. This is the current standard, and you need to know it and know it well. So, in summary, in order to meet the current standard underneath the DFARS 7012 requirements, you have to meet the requirements underneath the 32 CFR, the CUI registry, DoD policy, and the contract clause itself, and the 7019 and 7020 when it's applicable. The reason why this is true is because the 32 CFR 200214 says that you have to do this. Authorized holders, that's you, within your lawful government purpose, according to the contract performance, must comply with the policy in order, in this order, okay, this part, 32 CFR, it's referring to, the CR registry, and review any applicable agency policies and additional instructions. Those must be applied to how you handle, how you process, store, transmit CUI. That is a requirement, okay? You must follow the procedures in the underlying laws and regulations and government-wide policies, okay, specific to your category or categories of CUI. Controlled technical information is a given, and maybe export controlled information are another type of CUI. So you must follow the CUI laws, regulations, and government-wide policies and the applicable agency policies to the data when you implement the NIST 800-171 within the 110 controls to address each of the assessment objectives. So this is the standing requirements right now with no uncertainty, no ambiguity whatsoever. And in the 7019 and 7020 right now, you are not eligible for the current contracts under these requirements, the 7019 and 7020, unless you've done them. Nor are you eligible to award a subcontract in relationship to the 7019 and 7020 unless you've implemented the NIST 800-171, unless you've conducted your DoD assessment methodology and self-assessment underneath the V1.2.1, and you have an SBR score, and that SBR score is properly reported to the DoD. You are not eligible for your current awards, nor are you eligible for your subcontracted in order to award a subcontract. So in totality, this is the standard as we know it right now. When we map that over into the CMMC 2.0, you will see how it migrates very cleanly and very, very deliberately, folks. Deliberately is what you need to worry about. Before we get to that, I want to summarize for those folks who may not have a strong technical grasp what you have to do. You have to implement the prescribed security requirements. You have to safeguard the CUI that you receive and you develop in performance of the contract. You have to assess yourself and score yourself underneath the DoD assessment methodology V1.2.1 using the NIST 800-171 alpha. That is the standard. You have to have highly detailed documentation that's adequate and sufficient to demonstrate the fact that you've met the requirements and your score that you've given yourself is appropriate and warranted. Underneath that, you may have additional POEM items that you have yet to complete. That is going to change, folks, and we'll get into that. And you have to complete the full implementation. There's an expectation by the DoD that you will or that you have done that already. The rule assumes that you have already implemented these requirements. That's the important thing. And many of us haven't. Most of us haven't. So when it says, look underneath the underlined portion on the left-hand side of the screen, required that the DFARS 252, 204, 7012 clause have been implemented. Okay, that's the reason why this is where we start in understanding the 2.0 rule. You have to sustain the documentation underneath the current requirements annually. Okay, now, underneath the 32 CFR Part 170 rule, it moves those requirements underneath the existing requirements underneath the 2.0 rule. So the 2.0 rule encompasses the 7019 and 7020 clauses. So that's not going away, folks. And what it does specifically underneath what is now will be the DFARS 252, 204, 7021 contract clause is that it includes a new document called the CMC assessment methodology, which I suspect will be a rewritten version of the DoD assessment methodology v1.2.1. Okay. So if you're using the DoD assessment methodology, I would not change anything at all. It's an additional requirement. Okay. And you also use underneath the new requirements, the scoping guide underneath the v2.11 scoping guide. So this is the totality. This is the totality of the requirements as they are right now. Underneath, the ones that are above are underneath the DFARS 7012. The ones that are below are the ones that will be encompassed within the CMC 2.0 rule. Okay, and it looks like this. All right, so with that, the CMC rule assumes that you've done everything above it, and that in order to be eligible to be certified underneath the CMC 2.0, you must have done those things, okay, in order to be eligible, because the requirements are in addition to the DFARS 7012 requirements. Okay, so that is that because that foundation is not well understood that I just reviewed in its entirety, it's vital and important that we recognize that that is the standard for which will be expected underneath the CMC 2.0. Now, it might be new to you about the DoD policy. You may not have understood that, and I will show to you in brevity. And if you want to know more, we can ask about that in the questions. I'll show you in brevity why what I said is accurate and reliable and consistent with the standard. Underneath the CMC 2.0 rule, within the Appendix A and the Part 170, that section is titled Guidance. Okay, underneath the guidance and underneath the subsection 20, it asks and provides clarification about what all is encompassed within the requirements. And you're happy, you're welcome to either look this up in the rule directly or certainly to screenshot this. Okay. I'll bring your attention down to what's said below. Additional instructions and manuals address DoD information security policy, including the DoDI 5248, not exclusively, including, which establishes policy, assigns responsibility, and prescribes procedures for CUI throughout the DoD for federal and non-federal information systems, to include the implementation of NIST 800-171. As required, a requirement for CMMC assessments provides DoD assurance for contractors have implemented the required cybersecurity protections. The requirements of this rule will be implemented in association with the 48 CFR acquisition rule regarding CMMC. So you can expect that the new rule issued underneath the 48 CFR 252, 204, 7021 will be absolutely clear that it encompasses all of the requirements relative to the DFARS 7012 contract clause. There's no ambiguity about that. It states that over and over and over in DoD policy. You may not have been aware of that, but it is a requirement. Just like the FAR clause, FAR clause 250 or 52 20421 is 100% applicable to federal contract information, as is the requirements underneath the DFARS clause 252 204 7012. Okay, so that provides clarity and certainty in addition to what's already succinctly and explicitly stated in standing DoD policy right now. Okay, so let's bring it all together. So to understand CMC 2.0, it requires an assessment, either by yourself, a self-assessment and for the purposes of affirmation, or a third-party assessment of the security controls that you have to implement in order to protect the controlled and classified information, and to ensure that in other words, the management controls, operational controls, and technical controls are implemented correctly, operating as intended, and producing the desired outcome with respect to meeting the prescribed security requirements according to the CUI that you have in your environment, controlled technical information, and perhaps other categories of CUI, often including export controlled information. Those make the totality of the CMC requirements as required underneath the 32 CFR, as required underneath the DoD Instruction 52048, and as required underneath the by the DFARS Clause 252, 204, 7012. All of these, again, are standing requirements, but they are encompassed within the CMC rule, CMC 2-point rule explicitly. So that means that all the purple boxes are now well integrated into the rule, and I 100% expect with confidence that they will be well integrated into the DFARS Contract Clause 252, 204, 7021 when it is issued or released for public comment underneath the 48 CFR rulemaking process, and then issued out underneath the contract clause itself, underneath the DFARS. What that means is that we have to implement the practices, just like I said before in 21 and 22, 2021 and 2022, when I first developed this diagram. We have to implement the CMC practices and the scoping guidance because it's explicitly stated in the 2.0 rule, okay? And those are controls when they're implemented. And we have to have evidence that, acquired to address each of assessment objective in relationship to how we meet the prescribed security requirements. That will be evaluated and assessed by a third-party assessment organization, or with the same appropriate rigor underneath the self-assessment during the examination of our documentation, the interview of those responsible and accountable, and then the testing of those controls to demonstrate the fact that they are implemented correctly, operating as intended, and producing the desired outcome. That is the met, not met criteria explicitly stated within the model, within the CMC assessment guide, and explicitly stated within the definition of this of assessment underneath the CMC 2.0 rule. What's different though is that the development underneath the 2.0 rule during the conducting of the self-assessment for the purposes of your SPRS score is conducted underneath the CMC assessment methodology, a different version of the current 1.2.1 document underneath the DoD assessment methodology. That will be required as a part of the DFARS 252, 204, 7021. Okay. So the appropriate reference standards for this are going to be the 32 CFR Part 170, the rule itself. It'll be the NIST 800-171 Alpha. It'll be the CMC L2 scoping guide, the 2.11 version of that, and the CMMC assessment methodology when it's revised and released. Okay. So that is the standard for CMMC underneath 2.0. You will see when you compare, maybe not from what you knew previously, but when you compare what was underneath the current requirements to what is underneath the current requirements, that they're virtually identical, except for the versioning of the CMC self-assessment or CMMC assessment methodology. So this is the standard, folks. All right. Now, let's look at that again to summarize what I just told you. There will be an assessment, and it will be demonstrated or become evident underneath two different types of requirements underneath the rule. You must have met the DFARS 7012 requirements and the 7019, 7020 underneath the current requirements. It assumes that you've done so, by the way, and the rule does. And then you're either going to conduct a self-assessment with the purposes of affirmation, or you'll be required to do a third-party certification. My expectation is, in my opinion, my expectation is that there will be very few technical programs that will allow for self-assessment. What's also unique about the rule, it says that the when I get to applicability, you know what? I'll save that. We'll call that underneath the applicability slide. So suffice to say, we have to conduct a self-assessment, and we have to affirm that in a Sarbanes-Oxley style affirmation to the DoD annually, or we have to execute the third-party assessment, okay, and with the annual affirmation, okay, to underneath the certification criteria underneath the 2.0 rule. So, what is required now that we've seen what is required underneath the 7012? What are the changes underneath the 2.0 rule? And let's summarize what's really the meat and potatoes for what's required underneath the 2.0 rule. So we have to implement the prescribed security requirements to protect CUI. That's 100%. We have to safeguard the CUI that's received and developed in performance of the contract, whether it's marked or unmarked. That the rule and the requirements are indifferent. Okay. Assess and score ourselves underneath the CMC assessment methodology, and using the NIST standard 171 alpha as the standard. Okay. We have to develop highly detailed documentation that meets the evidentiary requirements for sufficiency and adequacy as the given example that's on the DoD assessment pre-assessment portion of their website right now, which I encourage you to go see. Okay. We have to gather evidence that supports our score, both if we're conducting a self-assessment or whether we're being assessed for the purposes of a third party. For all of the items. So we have to have adequate and sufficient evidence, and that has to support our score, and it has to support the actual assessment itself. There are POEM items, and there are POEM items that are allowed, but there are POEM items that are restricted, and we're going to talk about those in detail. Restricted means that they cannot be on the POEM at all, folks, at all, right? At all. So that's what POEM items are not allowed or prohibited to being on the POEM are what items, not POEM items, what requirements and controls are not allowed to be on the POEM are very important for you to know, and we'll cover that in detail. The self-assessment score or the certification score has to be a minimum of 188. Minimum of an 88 out of a 110. Okay. There cannot be any unrestricted POEM items, any items that are restricted, in other words, on the POEM itself. So all of the POEM items are unrestricted, and those have to be reconciled within 180 days during that conditional assessment period. If they're not reconciled in 188 days, you are no longer eligible for that contract. That's very important that you know. Your conditional status goes away. When you are certified, or when you're aspiring to be certified, you have to score of a minimum of an 88. And the findings that you that are found during that assessment, okay, must be reconciled within 180 days, or that conditional certification goes away, and you're no longer eligible for your contract if that's a requirement on your contract, okay, which we would expect it would be. You have to sustain and affirm your documentation annually. So it's not fire and forget, folks. It's not every 3 years we'll think about CMMC, okay? Because you're affirming, meaning that underneath the pretenses of the False Claims Act and penalties relative to the performance of the contract, you are subject to those. And if you do not keep up the documentation and affirm that documentation annually underneath the SPRS system, which will obviously be modified. Now let's talk about eligibility. Okay. So eligibility is very important. Okay. That's the reason why I've included on here. The rule states that the DoD program managers or the requiring activity, whichever one, likely to be the program managers for most contracts regarding technical information, are responsible for selecting the CMC level. The rule doesn't provide enough detail to say whether or not they're going to say, well, these folks need to be CMC level 2 certified, and these people don't. What's likely is that it is one blanket determination for the entire program. That's what's likely. There's no, right now, there's not enough information to know that. And that is the expectation that I would have, just given time and experience and historical precedent. So a DoD program manager is going to say, all right, this contract has to be met underneath the CMC level 2 certification requirements, period. And for all flow down and all subcontractors, and they are explicitly encompassed within the rule itself. Okay. All DoD contracts and subcontract awardees that will process, store, transmit information that meets the standards for CUI and FCI. Notice it didn't say marked, by the way. It meets the standards. In other words, underneath the 32 CFR, the information would qualify as CUI. That's the explicit language within the 32 CFR rule. So that information, in other words, that would qualify as CUI, okay, on a contractor information system must be met. That includes all private sector businesses and entities comprising the CMC assessment and CMC certification ecosystem. That's everybody, folks. All right. And the program requirements will be included on all solicitations that are appropriate for those requirements. So there's no wiggle room here. And underneath the 32 CFR, it says it explicitly states the flow down as a requirement from the prime contractor down to the subcontractors within the supply chain. Why does it do that? It does that because it's already DoD policy that must be done. Okay. So when it says prime contractors shall comply and shall require subcontractor compliance throughout the supply chain at all tiers, it means at all tiers. Why? Well, because that's already DoD policy, if you're not aware of that. So the requirements are explicitly flowed down. They are a prerequisite to certification, folks. So your suppliers and your subcontractors must meet these requirements in order to be eligible within the CMC 2.0 certification process. That's the applicability, folks. Okay. So let's talk about plan of action milestones and requirements and restrictions. Okay. So underneath the part 170.21, notice I've included the citations in here. And people who tell you things that do not include citations in there should be highly suspicious about what they're telling you. Okay. So please do not accept empty platitudes from quote unquote subject matter experts about what they claim to know or don't know. Do not place the future of your contracts, millions of dollars, our national security interests, your family's interest, your personal interest, your company's interest, and the platitudes that people provide you without sufficient reference and citation. It doesn't matter where or whom that comes from. Okay. So that's my only warning to you within this broadcast. So with that, notice underneath the part 170.21, the most important thing here is that the external connections regarding the processing, storing, and transmitting of CUI data, external connections is not allowed to be, is a restricted item from your POAM. It may not be allowed to be on your POAM. You must have this done and complete and fully met and submitted. The external service providers must be eligible to be certified in order for this criteria to be met. Okay, they may not yet be certified because there's a chicken and egg problem. But the reality is your external connections that process, store, transmit CUI or security protection data, and we'll talk about that, okay, are not eligible to be on this requirement for 3.1.20. Now, the additional requirements B through E are in the relationship to the management of CUI. Notice how important it is to the DoD that those requirements are not allowed to be on your POAM. Okay, so it's vital and important that you realize that the protection of CUI, the safeguarding of CUI, is at the cornerstone of the 2.0 rule. And the importance of that is validated, okay, and substantiated by the fact that these requirements, B through E, are not even allowed to be on your POAM. Okay, so with that, we have to take a special consideration to what are the implications of the 3.1.20 external connections a requirement, okay, not being restricted on your POAM. And let's dive into that. So there's a lot of controversy about external service providers and what is or is not constitutes an external service provider. I'm going to provide you the information that's presented within the rule and the historical information, and I'll tell you where I believe the ambiguity to be, okay? Everyone has an opinion. All of them should not be judged equally, all right? So with this, let's look at the definition of external service provider, okay? And I'm going to read this to you because it's very important that be word for word. External service providers mean external people, technologies, and facilities that an organization utilizes for the provision and management of comprehensive IT or cybersecurity services on behalf of the organization. So that's an organization that falls underneath very specific definitions, which I'll go to in just a second, on behalf of the organization, executes requirements that are necessary to be done. They may execute requirements, but in order to execute those requirements, they provision and manage comprehensive IT or cybersecurity services on behalf of the organization. Okay, in CMMC in the CMC program, CUI or security protection data, there's a description there that's problematic and needs a full definition, which will be in the provided comments to the DoD. Okay, must be processed, stored, or transmitted on the external service provider assets to be considered an ESP. Now, this is a CMC specific term. Okay, so this description and this definition does not exist anywhere else. It is a modification of an existing definition. Okay, but the definition in its specificity, okay, does not exist anyplace else. Now, what I should highlight to you is we've got some important things here. What does the ESP do? What is the ESP doing? It's a processing, storing, or transmitting on their assets information that is either CUI or security protection data. That process, stored, or transmitted is very, very important because that's explicitly encompassed within the access control 3.1.20, and that's also relative to the access control requirements 3.1.1 under C and F for what networks are authorized. So meaning that an external service provider that has an external connection, that is an external network underneath 3.1.1 on the part C and F underneath the assessment objectives may not be authorized unless it meets the requirements relative to the definition and the stated requirements underneath the CMC 2.0 rule. Okay? And we're going to talk about what that really means. So when you have underneath the NIST standard 171, the definition of an internal network versus an external system that's encompassed within the requirements 3.1.1 and underneath 3.1.20, underneath the Rev 2, there's important differences. The important differences is that in the internal network, the organization responsible for the requirements, responsible for the contract and performance of the contract, has direct control over the organizational employees and contractors within those resources. Okay? So direct control, they're organizationally controlled. Underneath the direct control, that's an internal network. What makes an external network, and an important difference is underneath versus CMC 2.0, is underneath the NIST 800-171, it defines that external system as a component or system that is outside the authorization boundary. But we are going to underneath the 2.0 show you that now it is internal to the authorization boundary for the purposes of certification. It's an additional requirement. So let's put that aside for a second. So a system or component of a system that is established by the organization for which the organization typically has no direct control or the application of required security controls or the assessment of those security control effectiveness. So the organization responsible has typically no direct control of the application of the security requirements within the external system, nor has no direct control underneath the assessment of the security control effectiveness. They have to take the word, if you will, for it of the external system. That external system may provide services. And again, underneath the NIST 800-171, those external services are outside the authorization boundary. Within the CMC 2.0, they are explicitly within the authorization boundary for the purposes of certification or self-assessment. So again, an external system is provided by an external system service is provided by an external system to the organization that has to meet requirements, and those requirements impact security control inheritance. Underneath the CMC 2.0 rule, I want to call your attention to the fact that external service providers are explicitly stated that they incorporate the people, technology, and facilities into the boundary of the assessment for the purposes of certification. And the reference and citation is right there. So that means that the organization seeking certification or the organization seeking assessment, okay, OSA versus OSC, the two different types of assessments, are responsible and accountable in the CMC assessment process for their external systems that process, store, transmit security protection data or controlled and classified information, and that responsibility and accountability is directly incorporated into the boundary of the scope for the purposes of assessment. That's very important that you realize that. So what does that mean? So picture's worth 1,000 words. That means that in security control inheritance or inherited practices are passed down wherever the CUI and FCI flow, whether you're a supplier or whether you're an external service provider. The difference there is that the external service provider has a connection that processes, stores, or transmits security protection data or CUI with the contract whom they are providing those services to. Okay. So wherever that flows within that external service provider, when it's process, store, transmit, okay, that is the key. What type of data that they process, store, transmit is the key to the security inheritance. What they have to do to be compliant. But what the external service provider, the connection to the external service provider, and incorporates security control inheritance into the authorization boundary for, in this case, Acme Manufacturing, because of the external connection that they have. All right. Now that's a mouthful, but this relationship and the importance of it is very important. So if you want to understand this relationship and the use of external systems, although the NIST 171 Rev 3 is not in the scope, my discussion with Dr. Ross was very enlightening. And the NIST 171 Rev 3 is a better explanation of the requirements in Rev 2, meaning that those requirements that are the same, okay, that there are no changes to the requirements. It's simply a better explanation of the current requirements. So if you want to understand the requirements, current requirements better, the discussion in the NIST 171 is not very good, okay? And the CMC assessment guides examples are even worse. So I encourage you to go to the NIST 171 Rev 3 and read the discussion paragraph about the 3.1.20 use of external systems, and you will better understand how this relationship exists right now. And the requirements is intended to be met right now. Okay. That will provide you insight. Okay. And again, insight to the use of external systems. Now, again, the wording has changed underneath the assessment objectives, but the intent hasn't changed at all. Okay. So it's very important that you realize that the intent is the same. Therefore, you can apply the discussion and you can apply the explanation of the assessment objectives to how you would meet those requirements underneath the current NIST 171 Rev 2. All right. So when we talk about the external systems and we talk about external networks, right, and external services provided by external networks, we're talking about directly about the external service providers. What makes the difference in the external service providers is what type of data that they process, store, or transmit. Okay. And let's dive into that a bit more. Okay. So external service providers underneath the cloud service provider, okay, underneath the D4 7012, when it processes, stores, or transmits CUI, it must meet the FedRAMP monitor equivalent. Okay. That's the requirement. Okay. So it's vital and important that an external service that has an external connection to an external network that processes, stores, or transmits CUI right now has to meet the cloud service provider's requirements underneath the D4 7012. Okay. So when we think about that in terms of that, the OSA who utilizes an external service provider other than, this is directly from the rule, other than a cloud service provider, then the external service provider must meet the CMC level 2 certification assessment. Notice that those external service providers other than cloud service providers cannot self-assess. So they must be certified. They must be certified. Okay. If the ESP is internal to the OSA, external system is internal to the OSA, the security requirements implemented by the external service provider should be listed in the OSAs or OSCs. It applies to both. Okay. I just quoted it from one section, but it's the language is identical. So OSC or OSA, that's organization seeking assessment or certification. So if the ESP or internal is internal to the OSP, meaning the security requirements implemented by the ESP should be listed in the OSA's SSP to show the connection to its in-scope environment. And well, we can talk about that if we need clarification. In the CMC program, CUI or security protection data must be processed, stored, or transmitted on the ESP assets to be considered an ESP. So the ESP not simply having access doesn't make it an ESP, although it may have to meet requirements related to the CUI itself, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But the CUI itself isn't considered an ESP unless it processes, stores, or transmits security protection data or the CUI itself. Okay, that's important when we talk about the devil in the details related to external service providers, and we can spend some time talking about that. So let's bring it all together. So we've got external service providers that are processing, storing, or transmitting CUI or security protection data through an external connection to Acme Manufacturing. In this example, they are an external network, not an internal network, and they are processing, storing, or transmitting CUI. Okay, then they have a security control inheritance, and that inheritance depends on whether they process, store, transmit CUI or they process, store, transmit security protection data. Okay. Now, let's compare the two, because here's where the ambiguity is. An external service provider, okay, there are two types of external service providers. And we use the language of the rule itself to bring clarity about this. There are other external service providers, and then there are external service providers that are cloud service providers. Okay, it doesn't define what other service providers are outside of cloud service providers. It doesn't do that very well, but it provides the definition of a cloud service provider from the CISA source citation, which is fine, but it doesn't help us. And here's the reason why. If I'm a cloud service provider, I'm underneath. I have an external connection. I have an external network. I provide external services that process, store, transmit CUI. Then I already fall underneath the DFAR 7012M. There's no change there. Okay. The ambiguity is, well, what happens if I'm an external service provider that I didn't think was a cloud service provider? Like a managed service provider that has an external connection, that is an external network that provides external services, and I process, store, transmit either or both security protection data or CUI. Do I fall underneath the security inheritance requirements of a cloud service provider, or I'm only required to be a CMC level 2 certification? Now, the historical precedent for that is that processing, storing, or transmit CUI makes the organization falls underneath the cloud service provider provision. It would be an organization that provide external services that would process, store, or transmit security protection data that would fall underneath an example of a managed service provider. However, there is some ambiguity about this. What I would say to you is that the definition will be clarified, and the definition is very impactful to the managed service providers. And here's the reason why. It's because, I'll explain why in just a second. When you have a relationship in your managed service provider and you're processing, storing, transmitting CUI underneath the current requirements, you are a cloud service provider because there is no other definition for you. Now, the external service provider definition underneath the 2.0 doesn't differentiate explicitly between do other external service providers process, store, or transmit CUI. If you believe that, you're reading into that rule, because the historical precedent is that any organization that met that criteria would qualify as a cloud service provider. Now, before I get to an important distinction that we can hopefully have underneath the rulemaking process, I want to bring in something that's impactful to both any external service provider. The external service provider that's required to meet CMC Level 2 certification must be eligible and qualified to access the CUI, okay, no matter what. So if they are not eligible, if they're not qualified to access CUI, then they can't be certified. If they're not, meaning that if the control technical information or the ITAR or export control category prohibits that organization for whatever reason for accessing that CUI, for example, maybe there are foreign persons there that work there, right? Or it's not a sovereign cloud underneath the ITAR or underneath EAR control requirements. Okay, then that organization would not be eligible. Okay, so if it violates CUI underneath CUI laws, regulations, or government-wide policies, then you can't meet. Then you're not eligible. If you are restricted by limited dissemination control or a status of an individual that works for that organization that would have access to the CUI, or you don't know the status of the individuals that would have access to the CUI, then they are not eligible nor qualified. If they haven't gone through the a minimum DoD requirements for training relative to underneath the CUI notice for accessing CUI to understand their responsibilities, they're not eligible. Okay. Would you have, if it would violate a DoD policy, then they would not be eligible or qualified. And if it's restricted for some reason by contract underneath terms and conditions, for example, you're using a provider that houses your data overseas. Many prime contractors prohibit this explicitly within their contract terms and conditions. So the external service provider, no matter what they're called, must be fully eligible and qualified to access the CUI. And if they do process, store, transmit CUI, they must be fully eligible to process, transmit, or store the CUI underneath these prohibitions. Now, something that could help provide clarity underneath the managed service provider definition, underneath the Cyber Incident Reporting Act for critical infrastructure, which is current law, U.S. law, it provides a definition, an explicit definition for what a managed service provider is. The incorporation of this definition into the rule would be absolutely critical to providing crystal clarity about what is required, because you could simply include the terms that managed service provider that meets this definition, that process, stores, or transmits CUI must be or must meet the cloud service provider requirements. Managed service providers that process or transmit or store security protection data must meet the level 2 certification requirements. So that a clarity of incorporating the standing definition, which is already applicable, by the way, to the CMMC 2.0 rule, it's encompassed within the requirements already, though they may not realize that, will bring clarity to crystal clear about what's necessary and what's required underneath the CMMC 2.0 rule. So how does that fit together? If I have the managed service provider definition and it says that CMMC 2.0 includes this definition and says that managed service provider, this definition, on behalf of the organization, process, stores, or transmits security protection data, then it must meet the CMMC level 2 requirements. It is not required to meet the cloud service provision requirements. And then a cloud service provider is not a managed service provider, okay, would also provide clarity, okay, underneath this requirement, underneath the definitions provided, okay? So those two things would be juxtaposed and would be explicitly defined based on the process, store, transmit, what type of data. If the process, store, transmit CUI, then they have to meet the FedRAMP requirements. If they do not process, transmit, or store CUI, then they meet the CMMC level 2 requirements for external service providers, okay? That would bring absolute clarity to these requirements. The exact same thing with the cloud services, folks. When you're choosing cloud services, they must be eligible and qualified to access the CUI, okay? This is the criteria given underneath the cloud service provider requirements, okay? This criteria is explicitly stated within the rule itself, okay? So it's vital and important that you realize that the distinction for the cloud service provider is totally different than the other external service providers underneath the definition of external service providers. The requirements are different. So it's important that we differentiate the type of data that the external service provider provides. And right now, underneath the historical precedent, if they process, store, transmit CUI, then that qualifies them underneath the cloud service provider unless they're explicitly accepted underneath clarity within clarity within the definition. How do I know this? I know this because I've already used the resources that are provided to us underneath the DoD Procurement Toolbox, Cybersecurity FAQ, and underneath this standing policy that's already provided to us underneath the DFAR 7012 requirements. Okay, I simply applied them to the rule at the points of ambiguity. All right, it's just that simple. Now, last thing I'm going to tell you. The last thing I'm going to tell you, then we're going to go into the the summary, and then we're going to go into the timeline, and then happy to take on requirements in last 10 or 15 minutes. And if we need to stay longer, I'm happy to do that as well. Okay. The DoD memorandum was issued on December 21st, 2023. That memorandum states what the explicit requirements are for cloud service providers that process, store, transmit CUI underneath the equivalency standard. It is a toll standard. Okay. In some ways, it may be more strict than the actual FedRAMP certification itself. Nevertheless, when you're understanding what cloud service providers that process, store, transmit CUI inside of your environment, it's important that you realize that they must meet the FedRAMP certification requirements, meaning that they already provide federal services to the DoD using that application or using that environment, or what's more likely, they can't be certified because they don't do that, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And they have to meet the equivalency standards, and those equivalency standards are described within this policy, okay, within this memorandum. So if you weren't aware of that, you need to read the memorandum and then compare that to the claims that your external network providers, services providers, whether or not they're cloud service providers or managed service providers, and they process, store, transmit CUI, where their current standing is and what their expectation in the future is. Okay. Implementation timeline. So let's talk about how much time we have left. There are 4 phases to the implementation. In order to be eligible for phase 1, you must have completed all the requirements for phase 1. So we're going to talk about those. But to be eligible for phase 2, you must have done the requirements for phase 1 and done the requirements for phase 2 for those contracts issued in phase 2 and phase 1 that have these requirements. That's the way it is. So let's talk about what the DoD says that it will do or what it may do. Okay. So I call this portion of the phase 0. There is no name for it. I've made that up. And because there is no a label for the current phase before phase 1. So I call it phase 0. All right. In phase 0, in order to be eligible for contracts that are issued with these requirements, you must be doing it right now and be ready for eligibility in January. Okay. That means that when the DoD says in phase 1, for all applicable DoD citations, and remember, we covered applicability, did we not? Underneath the CMMC 2.0 rule. So for all applicable DoD solicitation contracts, as a condition of contract award, you will have to complete the self-assessment and with the affirmation, or we may exercise an option. Okay, or we may require you to actually be CMMC level 2 certified. So in phase 1, you're going to have to be fully eligible for phase 1, or you may be provided an option period, or you may actually be required to be certified for that contract in phase 1. Phase 2 starts just 6 months later. So for you out there, I would encourage you that you need to know what the requirements are coming up for those contracts that you wish to be eligible for starting in 2025 during phase 1. Okay, because what the DoD says and what the DoD has written may be 2 different things, but what you need to fall onto is what the DoD has written within the rule until additional guidance is required. In phase 2, the eligibility begins in just 6 months later, and it says that it intends to include the CMMC level certification assessment for all applicable DoD solicitations as a condition of contract award. And we covered applicability already in the previous slide. Okay. So if the DoD program manager decides in the issuance of the contract during phase 1 or phase 2 that an organization will have to be, the organizations in that contract, participating in that contract, have to be self-assessed, then self-assessment will be the requirement. If it says that you have to be certified, certified will be the requirement. And so in order to be eligible, unless they exercise an option, which is a may, not a must, then you must be eligible. You must be working ahead. And phase 3 principally focuses on CMC level 3. Okay, phase 4, there are no contracts out there that don't have this requirement in it, and it's all in. So it's very important that you realize that you have a very, very short time if you have within your business development process eligibility requirements you're expecting in phase 1 that would ostensibly start historically in January of 2025. It may be March, but that in reality is there's not much difference there. Okay. And in phase 2, 6 months later, and phase 3 is on the anniversary of that a year later, the beginning of phase 2. Okay. And then phase 4 is the anniversary of that. Okay. So it's very important that you realize that there are what the DoD explicitly states, and then what its options are. And your assumption of risk is based on what you're ready to be eligible for, beginning in phase 1, beginning in phase 2, and what you may or may not be able to count on as options within those phases. Okay, so that's exactly as I've actionable items. To prepare for phase 1, you got to get busy right now. You have to have a minimum score of 88, which is very hard to do, folks. Okay, that's not the self-assessed. I gave myself 1,000 mulligans 88. I got substantiated documentation to meet the requirements 88. That documentation and that sufficient and adequate evidence should be exactly as expected underneath the DIBCAC, the DIBCAC self-assessment program as explained on the DIBCAC website, or the JSVA, or what the C3PO would certify. Okay, so it's identical. So you need to get busy right now. Okay, you need to remediate any of your POEM items, okay, beginning within the conditional assessment period, or they need to be completed by at least by January of 88 in order to be eligible for contracts that are issued from January, ostensibly when phase 1 begins, onward. Okay, and more guidance will come from the DoD, but this is the warning order, if you will, about these requirements right now. All right. So I know we've covered a lot of ground. We don't really have much that time in the stated and allowed period. So, but I will stay over until we get the questions, because we ran a little bit long. All right. So let's cover some ground within the questions, if you will. All right. Oh, thanks, Melissa. I'm sorry that I don't think we realized that the chat was disabled, so I apologize for that. If you have questions, please, feel free to put them in right now. Okay, to appreciate, so one question asked, I'd appreciate the understanding the timing of the new rules. All right, so the new rules are underneath this time period right here. Okay, there are items that can't be allowed on the POEM. That's correct, and those are ones we covered in the slide. Okay, if you do a self-assessment, they're not allowed to be included on your self-assessment or on your POEM once the eligibility period begins in the phase 1. Okay, you should be losing some sleep on this one. Okay, this is a hard one, folks. This is a hard one. Okay, so if you have any additional questions about that, feel free to ask them, because you may need some clarity. Okay, I don't want you to walk away with any uncertainty. So another question says, I work for a foreign-owned company with a single Active Directory. Okay, Active Directory. All right. Do you think we can pass the assessment with a single Active Directory on a single domain, or do we need separated? Absolutely, you have to separate that. And I say that, and I'm qualifying what I just said on two different reasons. If the foreign-owned company can access the CUI through administrative access or direct access, right? Then, and remember that the DoD instruction 5248, you need to look up the definition of access, and it says Access is the opportunity or the ability to access CUI. Okay. So if underneath the Active Directory, they have administrative or direct access to the CUI, and that is not permissioned explicitly by the DoD, okay, underneath the requirements, underneath the security classification guide, or under standing DoD policy, which is DoDI 5248, it requires that in most security classification guides, most programs that have one, it requires that foreign access, though it may not be restricted, must be explicitly approved by the Foreign Disclosure Office. Okay, so you could go through directly, if you're a prime, you could go directly to the DoD and a Foreign Disclosure Officer and request for that permission for foreign persons to access the CUI. You could go through, and submit that through obviously through the, if you're a subcontractor, to the Foreign Disclosure Officer for approval. If it's a category of CUI that foreign persons may not access, period, because of they are ITAR restricted or they're restricted underneath the EAR restricted categories, then they may not access it unless they are allowed underneath a specific license. So if you have a license underneath the ITAR, and the organization, the license includes your organization and the other organization, okay, explicitly within the license, they do not have access to that. They cannot have access to that. For the purposes of the ITAR, and it's for the same for the EAR, an organization must be the same employment, have the exact same employment. They have to be the same entity. They cannot be a parent or child entity unless they're incorporated within the provisions of the license explicitly. All right. So that may be bad news, but I can assure you that that's trustworthy and reliable information. So if you have an Active Directory and you have access by foreign persons administratively, and they are not eligible to access the CUI, then they cannot have access to the CUI if they're not explicitly permissioned by the Foreign Disclosure Office, and because they're not explicitly restricted, then you have to ask for permission for that. If they are encompassed within the license, underneath the export control license, then they may access that. But but remember, if they're provisioning extra network services to you, then they are in scope of the requirements. So they are explicitly in scope of the requirements. They're providing internal services, but they're functioning as an external organization, meaning you don't have control over them. Okay, that for those of you who don't have strong subject matter expertise, that may be confusing to you, but I hope that's clear to you. Okay. Foreign admins are a challenge, folks. Foreign admins are a challenge. So for clarity, he said, or she says, we have no foreign CUI. Okay, so the answer is absolutely not. Unless, check with your export control folks. That's the reason why that's the reason why the CUI stakeholders include far more than just the IT people. Check with your export control folks. If the foreign admin is not included within the provisions of the licensing, they may not have access to the information, and that may be required for voluntary disclosure, by the way. Okay. I used to run a export control compliance advisory firm, and so if you need help with that, you're more than welcome to reach out to us directly. Okay. We can help guide you on that. That's very sticky. Your foreign owned entity is not going to want to hear this. The foreign admins are not going to want to, they're going to resist at all costs. And so it may be helpful to you to have a voice in the wilderness which substantiates what your concerns are. And I promise you there's no wiggle room there. And I'm glad to work through the details with that. So Antonella asks, can you give specific examples of internal versus external services? Yes, I can, Antonella. So let's go to that. Very quickly. Okay. It is confusing, and I totally understand. Okay. I am an external service provider if I process, store, transmit CUI, or process, store, transmit security protection data. That makes me an external service provider. Okay. I am a cloud service provider. Okay. If I process, store, transmit CUI, and underneath historically underneath the current requirements, and my security inheritance is not CMC level 2 certification. My security inheritance is FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. If I am an external service provider that does not process, store, transmit CUI, I process, store, transmit security protection data, then my security control inheritance is CMC level 2 certification. Okay. Now, that's the foundation for external for an external service provider. Now let's talk about the subtle nuances there within the definition. Let's use the example of the anonymous person's definition. I'm Acme Manufacturing. I'm a foreign owned. My internal network. I run my internal network. My internal network must be compliant with NIST 800-171 171 requirements. There are external systems that I'm connected to that I do not control that help provide services on behalf of myself as an OSC. Okay, and in this case, it's the foreign parent and as a higher organization, because they have administrative access and probably, although he didn't explicitly say or she, they probably provide parent-like services, security monitoring, and many other things, and maintain control of those services. And the local admin of the local environment does not have control over those services. When they don't have control, they qualify as an external system. When they don't have control and the local parent company is providing services, then they are providing an external system service. Because that admin or that external system has access to the CUI, okay, regardless, it is encompassed within the requirements underneath the ITAR and underneath the control categories of the EAR, because the ITAR and the EAR say underneath control category said that a foreign person cannot have access to that data at all, period. Okay. Now, if they don't have access to that data, okay, then, or if they, let's say that they do have access to the data, they must be included within the ITAR license or within the BIS agreement, right, which allows them to have access, which can be the document can be amended and included within that. That's not a problem. Okay. If they're not, if it's not ITAR or EAR controlled data, but a foreign person or a foreign entity has access to the data, then the DoD policy says that they must have permission underneath the foreign disclosure officer, by the foreign disclosure officer underneath the program. So regardless, the DoD has to know about it, and then in order for them to have admin access and access to the CUI data, or right. Underneath the CMC 2.0, you can include the security protection data within those requirements, okay? But then it falls underneath a different set of requirements. If you're having access to the security protection data, then they must be CMMC certified too, okay? So they have network external system services that have access to process, store, transmit CUI, transmit security protection data, then it must be CMC level 2 certified. Okay. So that's the rule. That's the rule. Okay. I hope that provides clarity, Antonella. All right. Let me know if that helps. Okay. So Abdullah asked, and I know that we're a little bit over. So those of you who are in the that are constrained by time, I'm very grateful for the time and opportunity to spend with you. I'll stay on and I'll address the other questions for other folks, and happy to do so. But I just want to have a former thank you to those who are in attendance, who have to leave. I'm grateful and honored to have this opportunity to spend time with you. Please reach out to me over LinkedIn, and I'm happy to connect with you and to elaborate on details as needed and required. All right. So those of you who are staying on, Abdullah asked, so just by connecting to an OSC network, as depicted in this diagram, an IT service provider is still impacted by if its responsibility is to troubleshoot issues, but does not have access, but does not process, store, or transmit CUI. Okay, Abdullah, in order for an external network to access an environment that has CUI, at a minimum, they must meet the CUI requirements, meaning that all of the same requirements that you and I are responsible for underneath the CUI notice and underneath DoD policy, by being able to access CUI, okay, without restriction, okay, then they must meet those requirements. What the DoD is saying in the CMC 2.0 rule, if they have access and process, store, transmit CUI, then they must be CMC level 2 certified. Okay, so there's a slight but important difference there. So if the organization is not restricted from accessing the CUI, they're good to go. If I have restrictions for input limitations on accessing the CUI, for example, a person that does remote access, I do a virtual escort. They don't have any access to the CUI because I'm with them their entire time that they're working on the remote desktop, via remote desktop, or whatever it is that they're doing. Then I'm providing a limitation or restriction for their access to CUI. And then they close out their remote desktop. Their remote desktop has been explicitly permissioned to be able to access the environment. And I know that they've closed out, then they don't access CUI and there's no problems whatsoever. However, if they're going to remotely access our environment to perform maintenance or do whatever it is that they do, and they're accessing CUI, okay, then they must meet the requirements to be an authorized holder because they're accessing CUI without restriction. But if they're going to process, store, transmit CUI, then they must be explicitly, they must meet the explicit requirements underneath the external service provider definition. Okay. All right. So Peter, so would you say Amazon Web Services already had robust infrastructure in place? Yes. So Peter, Amazon Web Service has, they're a part of the CMC Industry Standards Council. They're absolutely stellar. I can't tell you how much I appreciate Travis and the Amazon team. They've been a part of the CMC Industry Standards Council almost from the very beginning, as a matter of fact. Yeah, along with Microsoft as well. So but what's important to know is that Amazon has got their arms around their requirements 100% without ambiguity. But remember that an organization that uses Amazon Web Services to process, store, transmit CUI, they must meet themselves the equivalency requirements. Okay, so Amazon, 100%, I wouldn't worry about them whatsoever, of course. But if an organization, a cloud service provider, is providing process, store, transmitting of CUI in their environment, then they must meet the full equivalency requirements underneath the cloud service provider provision and underneath the DoD memorandum that I showed you. Okay, so that's really important that you realize that, Peter. I hope you're still here. So where's the list of restricted POEM items, Nick asks. So we'll go over that real quick. So here's the restricted list of POEM items, Nick. Okay, that includes 3.1.20, and that includes 3.1.22, 3.10.3, 3.10.4, 3.10.5. All of those are about the protection of CUI. External connections obviously include CUI data through that external connection. Okay, I hope that's helpful to you, Nick. Amazon, yep. So John Long asked, is there a list of SIM providers who are in FedRAMP? Yes, there are. So go to the FedRAMP program's website. Now, I want to make a careful distinction, okay? You can be a SIM provider as a tool provider and meet the equivalency requirements and not be listed on the FedRAMP website. Remember that the FedRAMP website on the certified are limited to those providers that are providing services directly to the government. Not everybody's doing that. So there are many SIM tool providers who can or would meet the FedRAMP equivalency requirements that would not be listed on the FedRAMP certified website, and that would be perfectly fine. Okay. Remember, FedRAMP program is intended to certify those organizations that directly provide services to the federal government through their IT systems and connections. Okay, they're not everyone. Okay, so not everyone provides services directly to the government, but so a SIM provider can meet the FedRAMP equivalency requirements and not be listed on the FedRAMP certified website. So it's important that you realize that. Okay, thanks, John. So Wesley asked, when should a company reach out to an RPO or C3PO to start getting getting the certification? Well, that should have happened last year, but I encourage you that if you are lost in what I've told you, okay, it's very important that you reach out to a organization that has a reputation, okay, not just certified, okay, because RPOs, it's a great program, but it doesn't yet have the real meat the real meat into it that it needs to have in its training, and that's going to come. The AB's working on that. So I may be like a DTC, maybe an RPO, but do I really know what I'm doing? And so it's very important that you reach out to credible sources of information. There are many RPOs within the CMC Industry Standards Council, and I would always recommend them first. All right. C3POs. C3POs are great organizations, but remember that if you use a C3PAO, okay, for the purposes of assessment, for the purposes of consulting, you cannot use them for assessment. Okay, so I would be very careful in this, and the high quality C3POs are very busy. Okay, and they're not using their best people for consulting. They're using their best people for certification because there's enormous liability there. Okay, for underneath the Joint Surveillance Program. So I would be hesitant on using a C3PO for the purposes of consulting right now. I would go to highly qualified and with organizations within. I would always recommend the CMC Industry Standards Council that can provide you with the appropriate reputation, with appropriate confidence for you to make really, really expensive decisions about what you're supposed to do and how to meet these requirements to get them right the first time. All right. And then Melissa asked, after we do our self-assessments, any recommendations on who we can get to check it? Yes. So you can, I would recommend during your self-assessment that you actually use a third party, not necessarily C3PO, of course, to do that self-assessment that has a reputation, again, for understanding the requirements explicitly and giving you bad news, okay? And know this requirement is not met, and then being able to very, very succinctly and with clarity give you guidance about how to meet those requirements, all right? So not all organizations that want to do this are equipped to give you the appropriate guidance that you can listen to and follow with confidence. So what I would say to you is that do your self-assessment. If you have an Aspera score right now, I would not trust your Aspera score because, quite frankly, there's a lot in there that's not explicitly stated, as you may have realized from this broadcast. Okay, so again, you have to have a reputable and knowledgeable. I would trust to have a third party review the work that you've done and give you the direction and guidance that you need to definitively meet those requirements with certainty and with confidence. All right, and I would always recommend the CMC Industry Standards Council for that. When it comes up in preparation for its certification, okay, I would highly recommend that you do a pre-assessment. And that should be the time when there's no pointers required, that the organization, a third-party organization, not necessarily C3PO, but an outside organization, takes you through the requirements as if they were for the purposes of certification themselves. And that way, if you are not stone cold ready, I would not waste your money or the opportunity or the embarrassment on the purposes of pursuing a certification later on, okay? Make sure that you're prepared because remember, you're going to pay one way or the other, folks, okay? You're going to pay one way or the other. An organization, a reputable C3PO will not take you if you are not prepared to pass that certification, okay? All they have to do is spend 15 minutes with you, and they will know whether or not that you're even on the right track. And if a reputable C3PO tells you that, look, you've got a long way to go, you need some help, go get that help, folks. Believe them, okay? Or any C3POs that are just going to take you blindly and take your check and cash it are not the organizations that you need to go with, because that is extraordinary risk. All right. Next question. So read this to yourself, please. All right. Test 2.5-hour session. Yes, that's right. That's exactly what we did. Thanks, Brian. Okay. Any clarity between level 2 and level 2 self and level self-assessment and level 2 certifications? Who can assume to do only level 1? So that goes back to the applicability. Okay. Let's go back to applicability, because applicability is the basis for that. All right. So applicability. So applicability on the requirements between CMC level for the assessment and CMC level of a self-assessment and for certification rests on the program managers or the requiring activities if they don't have a program manager. Okay. I would highly suspect that those programs filled with technical data will very likely require certification. Okay. That is my opinion. Okay. And you're welcome to take a screenshot on this applicability. John Long asks, are green card holders allowed to handle CUI or just citizens? So, John, that's a loaded question, because there are some prime contractors that do not differentiate between green card holders and that do differentiate between green card holders and U.S. citizens. For the purposes of export control, a green card holder is a U.S. person underneath export control requirements. Okay, that's important that you realize that. Some terms and conditions underneath by the prime contractors explicitly state that you must be a U.S. citizen, okay, to access the data. So that means that you need to know what the prime contractor has within their explicit terms and conditions. If that distinction is not explicitly stated, then you go to the security classification guide. In the security classification guide, it should make a distinction between U.S. persons and U.S. citizens. Okay, some may not be well written, and when they said U.S. citizen, they meant U.S. person. Others, it's actually intentional. It's intended to not be a U.S. person. What's important that you know is that the DoD policy is what applies to the distinction between a U.S. person and a U.S. citizen, if that's a part of the requirements. Okay, underneath the current standing DoD I 5248. The Foreign Disclosure Office must be informed and approve access by foreign persons or foreign entities, okay, that in order for a foreign person or foreign entity to access the CUI. Okay, that's standing DoD policy right now. All right. Last but not least, to clarify, security protection data will include any log data that would send to a SIN. Yes, Dan. So security protection data would always explicitly, let me go to the slide. Okay. Security protection data. Okay. Security protection data would always be the explicit requirement for CMC level 2 certification. Always the explicit requirement. It's the process, store, transmit CUI, which historically has been the requirement of the cloud service provider. Okay. All right. All right. Russell Blake asked, if you have a SPRS self-assessment score of 88, will you be eligible for CMC level 2 contracts in 2025? When phase 1 goes into place, or do we need to get an SPRS score of 110? Okay, the answer to that is there's some details in there. Okay, I am eligible in phase 1 if I have an SPRS score of 88. I've conducted my self-assessment. I have affirmed to the DoD that I've met requirements, and I am able to complete the entirety of all findings and POEM items within 180 days. If I cannot, and that makes it what's called a conditional assessment. So that conditional assessment is only eligible as a status is only eligible for 180 days. If that 180 days pass and I do not complete those findings in those poem items, then I am no longer eligible. That conditional assessment is rescinded. Now, if the DoD exercises the option period within phase 1 on the contract, then it would be relative to the details within that option. Okay, within that, as stated within that option, and some of the contracts within phase 1 will be required to be certified. Okay, so that's sort of the conditions of that. All right. Amanda says, "Thanks, Reagan. Your wealth of knowledge. You're very kind of you. Thank you for that. I very much appreciate that." And Wesley Hardy says, "We have a third-party audit for this. We have been following up with one another in 7.7 just before certification." Okay, Wesley, 7.7 is a reputable organization, and I would trust their guidance. However, I would say to this that in the end, ultimately, you are responsible and accountable. So with that, what I would say to you is this, is that I thank you for the time and attention to be able to spend together and walk through these requirements. I would appreciate if you think that the CMC War Room and the discussion was valuable to you, if putting that in comments on LinkedIn, and that will cue other people up to the value of this time that we dedicate in just training education within the defense industrial base and within the CMC ecosystem. So that feedback's important so people understand that this time is valuable to you and where they can go to get information that they can count on and that to have confidence and clarity about the requirements. And I hope that an hour and a half really isn't that much time, folks, as you can imagine. So I'm grateful for you for the time that we spent together, and I hope that the information was valuable. Thank you very much, and have a great day. And I look forward to the CUI webinar, marking webinar on February 16th. And we are going to dive very much into the details of marking requirements and what is and is not control technical information. And I look forward to spending that time with you together. All right. Thank you and have a great day.